even if you got a few instruments in your tracks, there are certain things that you can do to make it sound full and stop you from overproducing. Hey, what's up? This is Ill Factor from beatacademy.com. And in this video, I'm going to share some music production tips and techniques while recreating Steve Lacy's Bad Habit. I'm also going to share with you principles that you can use to help you get a full sound even when using minimal instrumentation. So let's listen to the finished product. Here's my recreation of Bad Habit. So let's focus our attention on the drums. So I decided to go with an acoustic drum kit, and one of my favorite plugins to do that with would be Addictive Drums 2. So that's what I'm starting with. But instead of just browsing through specific kits that already come with a whole drum kit installed, I just actually decided to create a custom kit by clicking on the kick here and browsing through the factory sound kicks that I have included until I found a kick drum that sounded somewhat similar to the reference that I have on the song. So went with that, did the same thing for the snare drum, and so on for just the actual hi-hat and the ride and crash cymbal. What you might notice is that we have these arrows highlighted, and that is going to enable me to send the output of the kick drum and the snare drum and the hi-hats separately so that I can then use my stock plugins or third-party plugins to treat and kind of sound design and get the sound and tone that I'm looking for. So right here, what I want to do is I want to make sure I go separate out pre-fader so that the faders on the actual plugin itself has no effect on the volume being sent to the actual track. I will leave the overhead and the room mics here. And so that's why I have this track called Room, and that's where the plugin is at. Then what I decided to do was create two audio tracks. So I've got an audio track here. I have the input monitoring set to in, and I made sure that I was getting it from the track called Room, which is the Addictive Drums True track. And I'm going to click the next dialog or box that comes down and then choose Kick Addictive Drums 2. That way, it's only receiving the kick drum input. And then the same thing here with the snare. This is also great so that I can utilize any sends and returns within Ableton Live, which is my DAW. I can use that. I'm working now within the Ableton Live ecosystem rather than trying to just use the onboard effects in Addictive Drums 2, which are awesome, by the way. So now what I'm going to do is just a little bit of shaping, some sound design to kind of beef up the kick. We'll start out with a little bit of compression because when I listen to the reference, I'm hearing a lot more of the attack or the not the thump, but more of the rubbery attack of the drums. So I'm using the compressor for the sole purpose, not just to make things louder, but to accentuate that aspect of the kick. So I'm going to have a slower attack and a quicker release. And then to actually really help that aspect of the kick drum stand out, I'm using an overdrive plugin by Ableton Live. And then an EQ to just shape the overall tone, to boost frequencies that I want to highlight, and to dip out ones that I don't want. And then a saturator to really actually add a little bit more glue and just give a nice little gain here. So I've got about 3 dB. And so these are all the plugins that I'm using from stock Ableton Live plugin settings just to get the kick tone the way I like. Same thing's going on with the snare drum. Got a little bit of compression here. And the overdrive as well, EQ8, and the saturator. Same formula. As a matter of fact, I just dragged all those plugins right onto the snare drum and tweaked them accordingly. But I'll just go ahead and bypass these. Now, what we have here is the room, which is basically just the overhead and the room. I've combined them into two tracks. And I'm going to use the overdrive plugin right on top of that to get more of that emphasis of those two elements into the blend. Then I've copied the pattern, dragged and dropped it up to here, and I actually have a pattern, a drum rack just loaded with a sample to layer with this snare drum. What was going through my head when deciding to layer it? Here's why I did that. I did that because I felt I liked the snare drum the way it was with just the kick snare in the room, but I wanted to get a little bit more body and more beef. Now I could do that with an EQ, but when I was doing that, I just didn't like overall what it was doing to the snare. So sometimes it's just better to just find a snare that has that attribute that you're missing and just layer it gently with this, with another snare. And then I'm just doing a little bit of compression with the glue compressor. Actually, without the compressor, the snare really sticks out a lot. So that's what I'm doing there. And then I'm using Ableton Live's drum bus. This is really to add the drive and using the transients knob here to control, actually make it a little less sustain and more attack on the transient. And enhance the bottom end so we get some nice beef back on the kick drum, and an EQ to just overall shape the balance and tone when I start blending all the other instruments in. And now let's head over to the bass. So for the actual instrument, I'm using IK Multimedia's Moto Bass to create a realistic sounding electric bass. And I love using this plugin. And I know they've released Moto Bass 2, which is amazing. It has a lot more bells and whistles. Haven't upgraded to it yet, but just love using this for any type of electric bass patches that I might need. Just loaded up the 70s J bass the way it came and used an auto filter to take away some of the high end and enable the filter drive. So if you're asking why not just use an EQ, well, this is going to do the same thing, and I actually get an extra bonus filter drive saturation from it. Then I get a compressor set to the sidechain mode so that every time the kick is being heard, the bass ducks just a little bit. And I like using this to create a little bit of movement with the bass. This is without it. And this is with the sidechain. It just gives that little bit movement, almost as if the bass player was just kind of rocking back and forth while playing. Now next, let's focus in on the guitar. So I'm using Native Instruments Contact Electric Vintage, and I have this set to just a regular 8th note pattern. And I made sure to actually bypass any of the amps and effects, as I'm gonna go ahead and use some Ableton Live stock plugins to kind of recreate the tone that I'm looking for. So let's go ahead and add some amp amplification here. We're gonna go with the amp plugin, have it set to clean, and the output dual for stereo. And I'm gonna also match that with cabinet and put the dry and wet, just kind of toy around with the settings here. Now, what really gives that nice space is the chorus. So I'm using the Chorus Ensemble plugin in Ableton Live and really just saturating a lot of that with it. So you want to be able to just kind of play around with the amount, which is the amount of chorus or the amount of chorus that's being applied, and just make a very kind of slow rate, because speeding it up gives you a lot of that fluctuating chorus effect. Then using the compressor here for sidechains for a little bit of that movement, that pulse action with the kick drum. And then I'm going to add some dynamic tube, just a little bit of saturation and an EQ to boost some of the mids. Now, and then there's a compressor at the end just to kind of control the overall dynamics, so that when I switch from one chord to the next, I'm not getting one chord that just jumps out of nowhere. It's really just controlling everybody and making them live, happily ever after together. Now, one thing I'm doing here is I'm actually going to be sending some delay, reverb, and I have another, I've got this little trick up my sleeve here with send and return C. So for the delay, I've got just the Ableton Live echo set to every 8th note. And for the reverb, I have Ableton Live's room reverb here, just a stock reverb. But then for return track C, I have the pitch hack, which comes loaded with Ableton Live in the Max for Live audio effect section. So if you go to your Max for Live and audio effect subcategory, you want to go in here and look for pitch hack. Now, what's really cool is that I have this, and this is going to do some real-time pitch shifting processing. So I have this set to -12 semitones. I have it set to a rate of every eighth note. So at every eighth note interval, it's pitching this down a whole octave lower. And then I'm also turning up the reverse a little bit just to create some cool, texture to this. But let's solo just the return alone so you hear what it's doing. So if I was able to switch this to, like, let's say a quarter note. So it's only going to pitch at a quarter note interval. This is without it. Let's put the drums and the bass in together. So that lower octave guitar is subtle, but it helps fill in that space on the bottom of the guitar really nicely. And next, as I listen to the reference, I can hear like nice little Juno stabs happening. And so I figured, let me just go and load up the Arturia Juno 6V and just the basic classic road patch that comes here. But what I'm doing is I'm making sure that the envelope is pretty accentuated. So I'm going to have the frequency cutoff down and the resonance up. And that gives us this really cool, sharp little, that little stab. So making sure that the attack is up a little bit, decay down, and sustain down, and release relatively short gives you this type of effect. And it's really cool and subtle in a way that it adds texture to the actual chord progression of the guitar. So I'll play this just to accent certain parts. So if we play this together with the guitar, bass, and drums. Next, I wanted to create some texture in the background with some vocals. So what I decided to do was use Ableton Live's Looper plugin, treated as a loop pedal, to actually create a cool loop stacked of a single voice that I'm going to be doing. So I was saying, and then stack that a couple of times, add some harmonies, and then treat that as just like one stacked sample that I can drag and drop and implement as a subtle atmospheric texture to have in the background. Now, you could do this by just creating multiple audio tracks, recording, and that would be the same thing. But I thought I'd use the Ableton Live Looper. It's actually a lot quicker process to implement by doing it this way. And this can also spark some really cool ideas on how you can implement the Looper in your workflow. So I'm using the Looper plugin, which is found in your audio effects, delay, and loop. You would go ahead and choose Looper. And now, what I'm going to do is make sure that the song control is set to none, because essentially if I'm using this as a loop pedal and the first time I loop or I decide to stop, it can change the overall project's tempo. So I don't want that to happen. So I'll leave the song control on none, tempo control on none, and we'll leave the global quantization on global, which is set to 1 bar, meaning that it'll start to record on the downbeat of the next approaching bar. So if I play this, and I have my input set to monitoring right now. So what I'm going to do is just simply play this, track myself saying, and just kind of just loop that over a couple of times, and I'll show you how the process works. this is what we've been looping. This is the loop that we created. You can speed it up. And then I can simply just drag what we've done in the looper onto an audio track. So that's essentially what I did. I used a looper for that method, and this is the audio, this is the end result here. Just using an EQ to take away some of the low end, and using the hybrid reverb directly onto this track gives it some more space. And now I have that subtly in the background with the mix and the blend, and this is what we get. Hey, if you enjoyed this video, then I want to encourage you to click the link below in the description box so you can have access to this Ableton Live session, as well as many Ableton Live sessions or project sessions that you can find throughout this channel. I go ahead and break down a lot of songs that are charting on the radio, and I walk you through every aspect of that. So if you want to find more videos, simply just subscribe, hit the bell notification so you can stay up to date. Also, if you're looking for professional guidance with helping you produce your music or wanting to take that next step with your music career, then I would encourage you to visit beatacademy.com. In this platform, you'll find all the resources that you need to go from A to Z in not only learning how to produce your music, but how do you actually excel in doing it. Also, there's mentorship opportunities that I provide, as well as an accountability community that we have in place where like-minded individuals are coming alongside you, encouraging you, collaborating, and helping you take your best foot forward with your music. If this sounds like something you want to be a part of and you're serious about pursuing music production, well then visit beatacademy.com. Now, to download this session, as well as many other sessions and a free sample pack, visit beatacademy.com/pack or click the link below in the description box for more. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.